So usually when I do a race report, it's in a written format, and I wanted to try something a little bit different and thought I'd see how this audio thing works. Now, if you're watching this video, this is just a trail run that I did a couple of days after the Breckenridge Spartan Beast, just going on a pretty easy trail run through the Redmond watershed. This is a race report for the Breckenridge Spartan Beast race on August 27th, 2016. And I wanted to give you some of my thoughts of the race itself and a couple of the things that I did to prepare. I heard that a lot of people had a really hard time with this race, so hopefully you'll be able to glean some insight from the experience that I had. Breckenridge this year was an NBC race, which means that the field was stacked. It was an incredibly competitive race. Now, a lot of people did say that they had a lot of trouble with this particular race, but I honestly didn't think it was as difficult as some previous Spartan races that I've done. Breckenridge, for those that are not familiar, is a little bit outside of Denver, Colorado, and the biggest obstacle of the day was definitely the elevation. The race starts at 9,800 feet, and it just goes higher from there. In fact, I nearly passed out twice during this race. And the beast was a little over 13 miles long, so it took me just under 3 hours to finish. Now, the terrain itself was actually fairly runnable. I found that I had no trouble passing people. Nobody who was faster than me had any trouble passing me on the trails. It was mostly wide open, runnable roads. There was some single track, but nothing too technical, nothing that would really slow you down. So you didn't have to worry about your footing too much, and you could just open up and run as fast as possible. Now, because of this, I think that the terrain really suited my style of racing. For those that don't know, I have a background in running. And those who are familiar with me know that I have a background in really, really long endurance sports. So I have this huge aerobic engine. I can just keep on going and moving for hours and hours and hours without stopping. I attribute this a lot to my metabolic efficiency training, is what they call it. It's just my ability to burn fat better and spare glycogen so I don't hit the wall after running 20 miles in a marathon, for example. Now, when it comes to the Breckenridge race, I took all of that specialized aerobic training and fat burning and great aerobic efficiency that I've built up and just threw it all out the window. At high elevations, any athlete will burn a much, much greater proportion of sugar and glycogen, even at aerobic paces. So because of this, I didn't worry too much about it. Within 20 or 30 minutes of starting the race, I had knocked back my first energy gel, and I just went with sugar the entire time, as opposed to some of my lower carbohydrate fueling strategies that I've used in the past. Now, the race itself, I was with the elite wave of men that went off at 7:30 a.m. This was shortly after sunrise, so it was very early. It was very cold. It was about 38 degrees on the starting line. And we're back. Alright, I had to shut down that recording real quick because some of the landscaping folks in my housing development decided it would be a good time to break out the leaf blower. So picking up where we left off, of course, this is the Breckenridge Spartan Beast. The way that I went about my day is first thing in the morning, I think I arrived at the parking lot at about 6 a.m. It's important to note that the parking lot is in a separate location than the race village, so you do have to arrive a little bit early and make sure you account for the time that it takes to get on the shuttle and actually get to the starting line. On the shuttle and in the race village, I took my usual pre-race nutrition, which is just a Generation UCAN bar. I was still sticking with the pretty low carb stuff before the race to make sure that I wasn't spiking my blood sugar. Honestly, taking a high energy gel right before a race that jacks up your blood sugar, that's just shooting yourself in the foot in these longer distance races. So something definitely to avoid. So after tooling around and dropping off my bag, it was a really cold morning. I had a couple of hand warmers that I was carrying around with me that I was planning on just throwing away once the race started. After bag check, I made my way to the starting line. Of course, there's that usual gigantic crush of people there. Now, like I said before, it was pretty cold. It was about upper 30s. Luckily, the race venue is at a ski resort, and the ski lodge was open that morning, so there were a ton of people that were just hanging out inside the lodge before the race. Nobody was forced to just stand around in the super cold weather. Immediately out of the gate, once the race started, you start running uphill, as per usual with most Spartan races, and within a half a mile, the second obstacle that we encountered was the quote-unquote swim. It was really just about 200 feet of water that you could wade through. Not a super big deal, but it was cold, and if it wasn't for my awesome GH Unders shorts, I'm sure it would have been a miserable race after that. Luckily, the GH Unders, there's some really nice clothes that keep your skin dry even if the clothes themselves are wet. I didn't have any trouble with chafing or rubbing or uncomfortable clothes or anything like that. Now, since this was higher elevation, even though I am a long distance racer and I have really great aerobic fitness, within 20 minutes of starting the race, I did take my first gel. I was carrying 2 gels onto the course and assumed that there would be some kind of nutrition on course that I could grab along the way if I needed more. But yeah, after 20 minutes, I was already feeling famished and lightheaded, kind of like I usually feel about 90 minutes into a regular race. So I went ahead and took that first gel really quick right off the bat. And one of the big differences between taking a gel before a race and during a race is that it won't completely shut down fat burning if it's taken while you're active, as opposed to if you take a gel beforehand when you're sedentary and just hanging out, that'll completely shut down your fat burning and you'll be burning pure glycogen and going through those precious glycogen stores right off the bat. So the first, I'd say about 2 or 3 miles of the race was pretty much exclusively uphill before we peaked, got to the first peak, I should say, and started going back downhill. Now, along the way, we had a couple of interesting obstacles. And the log carry, which was super easy, actually. They did something different with the way they cut the logs at this event. Usually, most of the logs are fairly uniform in shape, but in this case they had a few that were just gigantic discs of wood. So if you are uncomfortable with carrying a regular log, it might be something to consider, that it might be easier to haul around just a gigantic disc instead of the usual longer, skinnier logs. So on the way back down after the first peak, again, this is where it kind of turned into some single track that was not too technical. It was still very runnable, very easy to really open up and run fast. And at this point, I was passing tons of people left and right. I know a lot of people like to go really fast out of the gate and then tire out and slow within the first mile. So the sprint course would have just come down after that first peak and gone straight to the finish line. The Beast course actually went up a second peak. So going back up to the second peak where we were reaching our top elevation, along the way they had the sled pull, which was, I believe that was the second time where I nearly passed out. We must have been around maybe 10,500 feet at that point, and I stopped and sat down to grab a hold of the rope to pull the sled, and just got super lightheaded and had to stop and take a couple of deep breaths just to make sure that I stayed awake, really. After the sled pull, we continued upward in elevation to the peak elevation, which also happened to be the sandbag carry. And after my experience in Palmerton, I was really not looking forward to what they had in store for the sandbag carry. It turned out, luckily, it was just a single sandbag that was about 60 pounds. I don't know exactly how much it was, but the real trouble was that this was the highest elevation. The sandbag carry was a fairly long straightaway with a short uphill right at the turnaround, and at the peak of that hill we were at 11,550 feet, high up in the air. Now at this point I was extremely tired, and of course we were in extremely high elevation, and usually I'm able to, just slow down a little bit if I'm too tired, but honestly just picking up the sandbag sandbag and holding it was sending me glycolytic. Like my heart rate was just through the roof. I could put my sandbag down and let my heart settle a little bit to maybe 50, 60 beats a minute, but just picking it up and standing still, my heart was going well over 120 beats a minute. So there was really no way to make it easy. If you take a look at my GPS data on my Garmin profile or on Strava, you see that my pace just plummeted for about 5 or 10 minutes when I was doing the sandbag carry. I think I averaged about 2 miles an hour through the sandbag carry, so it was really, really tough. But after the sandbag carry, it was all downhill from there, so I was able to just open up and start running. And by this time, I was feeling pretty depleted. I'm really not used to being in a glycogen depleted state, so that was something that I had to deal with, and I don't know how well I dealt with it. On the way down, I did try to make up as much time as I could to try to catch a couple of competitors, so I really opened up and just ran as hard as I could, pretty recklessly down a couple of these hills, and I actually fell on the trail for the first time this entire year. While I was running, I tripped. I don't even know what I tripped on, maybe just some rocks that were in the trail, but it was really just completely sprawled out on the ground kind of fall. So skin to knees, skin to elbows. It was more embarrassing than it was painful or anything like that, but I just hopped up and kept on going. And I think that was around mile 11 and a half or so. So coming into the final stretch, by this time, everybody's feeling pretty depleted, pretty bad. We're all super tired. Of course, like all Spartan races, there's a whole host of obstacles right at the end. So they had the last few obstacles included a barbed wire crawl that was actually downhill. It's the first time I've ever seen a barbed wire crawl down a decline. I've seen a couple that have you crawl uphill, and actually one of the previous obstacles was a slight incline of a barbed wire, but the barbed wire was pretty high off the ground, so I stayed in kind of a low crawl where I didn't even have my knees on the ground. I just stayed on my hands and feet and shuffled along. But at the second barbed wire, very close to the end, it was downhill, and I just tucked and rolled and came up extremely dizzy. I mean, I don't even know if I made any time by rolling through the barbed wire super fast, because I came up and it took a good minute or so before I could get my bearings and actually head in the right direction. They also had the dunk wall right at the end, as per usual with most Spartan races. Now, one thing that was incredibly shocking about this dunk wall was that the water was absolutely frigid. By this time, the air temperature was probably around 50 degrees, but the water was, oh my god, it was painfully cold. It was shocking how cold it was to get in that water and go under that wall. But it was the final obstacle right before the fire jump and the finish line, so I didn't have to worry about it too much. So that was my experience with the Breckenridge Beast. Let's see if there are any other interesting obstacles I'm forgetting. Now, one interesting aspect about the Breckenridge Beast is that most races have a map of the obstacles in the pre-race village that you can take a look at and get an idea of where the obstacles are and what they all look like. In Breckenridge, the pre-race map had well over half of the obstacles were classified. Like, you had no idea what you were getting into. Interestingly, they had no memorization wall, even though I was racing an elite and I could have just run by it anyway. I didn't see any memorization wall. They did have a rig. If I remember correctly, the rig was set up such that to cross a horizontal bar, and then they had the usual ring, and then something else to grab onto, and then another ring, and then something else to grab onto, and then another ring. Luckily, I have my super strong grip strength that I've been working on all year, and I've also been working on my dead hang, so I was able to just swing past any of the holds that were between the rings and just use the rings to get by, because I find that the rings are a lot easier to hold onto than the vertical ropes or the ropes with the baseballs tied at the end or anything along those lines. So I was able to get through the rig without too much trouble, and yeah, that was my experience with the Breckenridge race.